play Scotty Two Hotties interest music.
View from the other bench.
All right, as we mentioned in the news segment, we had that special guest with us this week to recap the top prospects game and, just chat prospects because we truly enjoy that. He is the national reporter for the NHL Draft / Prospects for The Athletic. We are pleased to be joined for the first time by Scott Wheeler. Scott, I'm assuming you got back to Toronto after a few flight delays. How are you on this final week of January?
Yeah, bit of an adventurous one. We couldn't touch down at the airport there, the island airport there in Toronto. So we actually had to divert back to Ottawa, which I think about an hour earlier we'd flown directly over. So ended up being a little 5-6 hour layover to Ottawa to get the plane refueled and wait for the weather to improve in Toronto so that we could head back to Toronto. But we made it in the end, and I'm home and enjoying a week off from travel. It was a busy month or so, if you will, there with the World Juniors and the two top prospects games in Moncton, and then obviously the USHL one in Plymouth. So I'm happy to sort of be through that middle part of the season. It's a marathon there, so.
Absolutely. That's one airport that I don't think I've ever been to is the Billy Bishop one, but sounds like it's a fun little airport to get into. Last week we had Jerome Brube from Hockey Prospect on to preview, and I'll start kind of where I started with him. When you look at the top prospects game, the casual fan wouldn't know a lot of the names on there other than some cute kids, but they would know Team White's Tij Ginla, who's kind of having a good season there for Kelowna. We didn't know much about him. He was quite the player for Team White, being their player of the game. The shot is what stood out for me. I think that was a quote-unquote pro release, as you would call it. Just what are your thoughts on the way Tij has been this year?
Yeah, sort of a nice story for him. He was obviously a depth player on one of the most stacked and deep WHL teams that we've seen in a long time in Seattle last year. He was actually a healthy scratch in the playoffs on and off, and when he was playing on their fourth line. Not uncommon on a Memorial Cup contending team and a team that ultimately won the WHL championship, especially if you're a 16-year-old who's trying to break into the league. But when you have the cachet that a player like Tij Ginla does, suddenly it's a pretty sort of bumpy road for you. It didn't sort of follow the path, if you will, that he would have liked. Then he gets traded at the start of this year from Seattle. Now that they're sort of in a full-on rebuild, he gets traded from Seattle to Kelowna. He gets to play with Andrew Cristall, who's obviously a second-round pick of the Washington Capitals and one of the most offensively gifted, if you will, players in the WHL. And things really started to click for him. No surprise. Very talented player, great skater, attacks at you on edges, can take you on edges. Really sort of dynamic angle type of player in the offensive zone, if you will. Good hands. The release that you talked about sort of really pops off his blade. It's actually funny. I talked to him a little bit about it, and it's kind of a traditional snapshot. We don't really see that in today's NHL. There's a lot of curl and drag. Everybody's trying to pattern after Austin Matthews and Connor Bedard now, and he just leans into it. There's not a lot of curling it into his feet, but he just leans into it, leverages his stick, and just sort of lets it go a la Jerome again, and Joe Sakic, and those sort of vintage releases of the 90s and early 2000s that we used to see once composite sticks were introduced. So bit of a throwback player. He also sort of plays hard. He's not a sort of physical power forward type like his dad. He's not going to drop the gloves. But he'll sort of fight for pucks out there and get after it on the forecheck, and then he's got some real skill in skating and obviously the shot on top of it. So he now looks like a bona fide sort of first-round talent and maybe even a front half of the first-round guy. He's not going to be a top 10 pick in this draft, but I think once you get outside the true cream of the crop in this group, once you get outside the top 12 or 13 picks in this year's draft, he's going to start to enter the conversation for a lot of teams. And I expect that if he's not picked in the teams, that we'll see him selected in the 20s.
Yeah, so when you get into Moncton, you've got a pretty good idea of most of these players. Were there any players that you were looking forward to watching just based, I guess, on limited viewings?
Oh, good question. Not necessarily based on limited viewings, but there were a couple of players that we wanted to see in this environment. The first being Henry Muse. Henry has been a top player for Hockey Canada at two different international events now, both the Hlinka Gretzky Cup and the U17s. He looked like a top player in the OHL last year as a 16-year-old defenseman who put up 30-something points. This year was a really, really sort of tougher start to his season. He's been much better of late, but had a tough go to his season for a projected first-round pick. The decision-making wasn't tightened up. He got exposed one-on-one defensively a bunch of times. And scouts, I think, as a result, sort of started to question just the way that he thought and processed the game, I think. And so this was an opportunity for him outside of the Ottawa 67s, outside of the OHL, to sort of look like a top player in a big game and sort of against other top competition in this draft, and sort of re-solidify himself as a sort of surefire first rounder in this group. And then I thought he actually had a couple of really tough shifts early in the game. He settled in nicely. He had some good moments late when they had the net empty and they were pushing to tie it. He was out there activating off the point, making things happen. They didn't quite break through and sort of create the goal that they were looking for, but I thought he was involved offensively. I thought he started to settle down. He actually performed quite well in the on-ice testing the day before the game, which I think was positive for him. So again, a bit of a mixed bag, which leaves scouts wondering, okay, is Henry Muse is that just what he is? Is he going to have some highs and lows, and are we comfortable taking him in the first round as a result? So he was probably the one that I and many others were sort of most interested to see in that setting. And then the other one, I mean, he's a big name, so hardly under the radar guy here, but Zane Parekh, just seeing him outside of Saginaw. Saginaw is such a unique system. They play so loose. They really let their players play on offense and make things happen creatively. There have often been questions about their players as a result. Cole Perfetti went through it. Pavel Mintyukov went through it. He's now going through it in terms of how much of it is Saginaw and how loose they play. Is he ever going to be able to button up defensively? I think we're now seeing that those questions are being answered by Pavel Mintyukov in the NHL with the Anaheim Ducks this season. I have a belief that Zane Parekh will do the same thing when he arrives in the NHL. But ultimately, Zane, for a defenseman, is never actually going to be a great defender, natural defender. He's not physical. He's not a super competitive kid in board battles and box outs and all of that. Defends mostly with his feet and his stick. There are a lot of players, very good players in the NHL who get by that way, but his offense is going to have to be so dynamic that it sort of overrides some of the defensive deficiencies, and I think ultimately it will be. He's clearly one of the most talented in 11 years of scouting these kids, clearly one of the most talented defensemen I've ever watched at this age. So there's a special quality there, even if the D isn't always going to be high end. So he's an interesting one. I thought in the game, Zane was good, not great. Got beat on a 3-on-1 that went off of his skate and kicked out to Liam Greentree, but I actually thought he defended that 3-on-1 about perfectly. Cut off the initial pass, which was intended for Jet Luchenko, and just by virtue of cutting off that pass, it actually redirected out to Greentree. So didn't really have much of a chance there. But otherwise, I thought he was good. He's never, as I mentioned, never going to be a super hard-nosed, hard-to-play against defensemen. So I think teams saw a little bit of that. And if you're not comfortable taking that type of player because he's not going to play that type of style, then so be it. But I think ultimately with Zane, you're going to sort of someone's going to bet on the offense near the very top of the draft. I don't know whether that's top 10 or top 15, but he's going to be one of the first players picked. And I expect at the NHL level, he's going to be an extremely dynamic offensive defenseman.
So I think it was during the first intermission, me and Jamie Tozer from Station Nation were talking about the game, and it didn't have the oomph in it because we didn't have the Macklin Celebrinis and the Cole Isermans and whatnot. And literally right after the game, Jeff Merrick has that tweet that there's looking to be a proposed CHL versus NCAA game that'll take over for the Prospects game. So I want to bring it back a little closer to Moncton as your number 3 player on your list, Cole Iserman. Moncton took him in the U.S. draft, and both Jeremy and I are hoping he shows up next year and what could be an all-in year for us. But I guess just what did the fans kind of miss not seeing in Macklin Celebrini and your number 3 player and Wildcat U.S. draft player in Cole Iserman?
Yeah, I mean, not just that, but obviously Caden Lindstrom is dealing with a hand injury, right, and sidelined as well. So there's that piece of it. Caden's going to be a top 10 pick in this draft and had to bow out due to injury. So, just a number of sort of high-end guys that weren't available. Obviously, Celebrini and Yzerman were never going to be a part of this game.
No,
That
no,
will change moving forward. Yzerman's an interesting one. I wouldn't get too excited about him potentially coming to play in the CHL at any point ever in his career.
You're killing us, Scotty. You're killing us. You're on a Wildcast podcast. Give us some hope.
Yeah. No, he's going to go off to BU and he's going to light it up, and he might even be one and done or two and done at BU, and then he's going to be playing in the NHL. But no, I mean it's certainly this year's group was defined by the defensemen. That was always going to be the case. Sam Dickinson, Carter Yakimchuk, Perek, who I touched on. Those were sort of the big names, if you will. Obviously at forward you had Berkeley Catton. They would have liked to have had Caden Lindstrom involved. That would have given the game a little bit more juice. It's a good but not great draft class. Certainly it pales in comparisons to last year, and not just because of Connor Bedard's presence last year, but you go down the list, especially that that special 2005 age group out of the WHL, whether it was Braden Yeager, Zach Benson, Nate Danielson. It was a really, really impressive group. Samuel Hanzik, obviously, he was actually injured. He had a sort of lower body injury, broken leg ahead of last year's event, so wasn't able to participate like he would have hoped to. But last year's event had a little bit more flair in terms of the high-end talent, and yet I thought this year's game was actually a more competitive game. The 4 goaltenders participating in this year's game were certainly a cut above the 4 goaltenders participating in last year's game, and that showed in their play on the ice, but also in the scoreline. So lots of good in this year's game, even if it didn't have the Bedard type. And I'm looking forward to the new format that you hinted at. It's a bit of a double-edged sword. On one hand, it will mean that instead of there being 40 players from the U.S. and 40 players from Canada that get to participate in each of their individual games, it's going to really narrow it down to only the true top prospects, which is a bit of a bummer, if I'm being honest, just because there are always players who stand out who wouldn't be in that group of 20. And it's always a nice showing for them. Even this year, player of the game, Raul Boyard. If it was a 20-player game against 20 players from the U.S., he wouldn't have been able to participate. There are similar standouts from this year's Chipotle All-American game south of the border, kids who, had it been a 20 versus 20, one team versus one team matchup, suddenly you cut the player pool in half that's participating in the game, and there are kids in the projected to go into the third, fourth round rather than the first and second round who don't get to show themselves. So that is a little disappointing, but on the flip side, it's going to be to have a series and to pit them head to head and to sort of drum up some of those competitive juices. It's going to be a much more competitive game. It's going to be a much higher quality game. There's going to be something on the line. I think the players are actually going to play for something, not just in terms of individual points and showing nice in front of scouts, but in terms of actually playing to win those games, which I'm not sure is always the case at the CHL Top Prospects game. I think there's a little bit of me that happens at the CHL game and at the All-American game, where they're playing all of their buddies, and it's just an opportunity to go out there and make plays and have fun. So this will tighten up the game. It'll be a more physical contest, I imagine, a more competitive contest. And ultimately, I think you'll see the best rise to the top. So I am very much looking forward to seeing what next year's 2-game series looks like. I would guess that one of the games is just going to be played in Plymouth, where they typically play the All-American game and where the National Development Program is played out of. And then the Canadian game will probably be some kind of rotation. Because next year was due to be the CHL Top Prospects game on the current rotation through the 3 leagues was due to be in the OHL. I would guess that it's an OHL host city for the Canada leg of the new series that they're planning for next year. As far as destinations go, I think you can probably look at some of the teams that have top 2025 prospects. There's 2 kids in Erie, in Matthew Schaefer in particular, and obviously Jordan Spence as well, who are legit prospects for next year's draft. Michael Nisa obviously is a top prospect in Saginaw in terms of OHL. Saginaw has just been awarded the Memorial Cup, so I don't think they're likely to get the first dibs at hosting next year's game. But those are sort of the top OHL prospects. I'm not sure they'll want it in Erie, if I'm being frank. Right. And I know they've recently denied hosting the Memorial Cup in places like Ottawa and places like Kingston. So you could maybe see one of the runners-up that lost out on the Memorial Cup might get a nugget from the CHL to have their city be the host for next year's game. But it's going to be a great showcase for whatever city gets it in Ontario, would be my guess. And then certainly if you're able to make the drive or the flight out to the Detroit area and jog over to Plymouth, it should be a lot of fun.
I I feel like a team that could use that kind of good publicity would be the Steelheads. I think they got a couple players. They got one from Sarnia and one from Peterborough, I think, that are drafted. Their names are escaping
Porter
me.
Martone and their goaltender Jack Ivankovic are both legit high-end prospects for next year's draft. Unfortunately, Mississauga has never, ever, ever been a draw in the OHL.
Yeah.
There's lots of talk these days about Mississauga potentially relocating due
Brampton,
to financial issues. Yeah. It just hasn't worked at that rink. It's really hard to drive to. There's no public transit out to the rink, even though it's in Mississauga. So my guess is they're going to want this game to be packed for its first ever game, and that wouldn't likely happen in Mississauga. So it is possible, though. Certainly Martone and Ivankovic are legit prospects for next year's draft.
And if they're moving to Brampton, and I think just put their name on the logo, maybe that's your first event. But now you had a tweet following up on that that we could see some Russian and Belarusians potentially coming back to the CHL. I just want to get do you have any more info on that? We talked about a little bit on our show about how it's kind of time to have the best players representing in the CHL, but also maybe down the line with the World Juniors. But any more info that you have on that kind of scenario that you tweeted out I think a couple weeks ago?
Yeah, a very sort of fluid thing. Certainly nothing set in stone, but there have been discussions about lifting the CHL import draft ban on Russian and Belarusian players. I know certainly agents have pushed hard for it. There is a lineup of kids in Russia and in Belarus who want to come over here and play in the CHL. There are recent success stories in the USHL, so there's a bit of a war that is being lost here, if you will, by in terms of on the ice by the CHL by allowing these players to go south of the border and play. Artem Levshunov is going to be a potential second or third overall pick in this year's draft. His preference was to play in the CHL, but he didn't have that option. He's a kid from Belarus who went over and played in the USHL in Green Bay last year and is now a star at Michigan State University in the NCAA. He was never planning to go the NCAA route. Matt Gridin of the Muskegon Lumberjacks is another player. He's a Russian, not a Belarusian, who has been a star for Muskegon in the USHL this season. He's now headed to Michigan. I know his preference also was to come over originally and to play in the CHL. So there are players that are eager to get back into the CHL. There are agents that would rather their clients be in the CHL than in the USHL in terms of development and in terms of getting recognized by NHL scouts. But ultimately, it's a very layered thing as well. It's not as simple as the CHL deciding to lift the ban. Mm-hmm. They also need to make sure that these kids can get their visas approved. Adar Sanayev, for example, a player who was drafted by the Calgary Flames in last year's draft, had major visa issues, both in Canada and now getting into college in the States. He was originally committed to Harvard and had to recommit to UMass because Harvard wasn't going to accept him due to being Russian and because he was having visa issues. So there's a Canadian government aspect to lifting the ban as well, where the CHL is going to need assurances from the Canadian government that if they lift the ban, that the players are going to get visas and they're going to be able to come over here and play. There's no guarantee that the Canadian government wants these kids coming over here to play. In many cases, believe it or not, these kids come from very wealthy Russian families. In many cases, their parents are involved in the Russian government. So there's all sorts of layers to sort of getting Russian players back over here. And it's a very complicated issue, obviously, with the geopolitics of it all. So it's being discussed. It's something that I think the CHL isn't necessarily opposed to changing at this point. It's just a matter of, okay, what does that look like? And is it practical? And what are the logistics in terms of actually getting players back over here and getting players reintegrated and visas and translators and all of that? They've got to open up those doors again. So we'll see what happens. But I would not be shocked if for ahead of the import draft in the spring, if there's some sort of announcement about a change.
So I wonder if, sorry, before you go, Jeremy, I wonder if there'd be a situation with like a transfer portal, or if you wanted to take one of those kids that's playing in the UCHL, if they open that up, or if it would strictly be you have to draft a player from across the ocean.
I think the most likely outcome is that there's no sort of USHL forgiveness. There are already pretty strict rules in place about players who commit to college and play in the USHL and not being able to re-enter into the CHL. There have only ever been rare exceptions to that. Obviously, Matthew Savoy went down and played in the USHL during the pandemic. That was largely because the WHL wasn't operating. Cole Sillinger did the same thing, played a year in the USHL because the WHL wasn't operating during the pandemic. He would have been he ended up going right to surprise some people and went right to Columbus in the NHL after that. But he would have technically been eligible to return to Medicine Hat, who owned his rights and play in Medicine Hat. So there are layers to it. Obviously, a few players in recent years. Chaz Lucius recently decommitted from college after playing a year at the University of Minnesota and went and played for the Portland Winterhawks. Kiefer Bellows did the same thing. So there are rules that allow college players to return, but often in cases, if you've chosen the USHL, it becomes very difficult for you to go either from the USHL to the CHL or from the CHL to the USHL. So my guess is that door won't be open for Russian players that are already in the USHL, and that it would just be players who are currently playing in Russia that then become, and Belarusia, or Belarus, I should say, who are then allowed to sort of participate in the draft again.
Okay.
Yeah, and just to end things, I know I want you to get back to your night there. I guess just your overall thoughts on the NHL draft and the idea of going to more of a decentralized model here in the coming years.
I mean, for selfish reasons, I don't love it. But even from an NHL perspective, and by selfish reasons, I mean it's a great event. It's a great opportunity for people like me in the media, for NHL teams. Everybody, it's the only time of the year where everybody in the hockey world is all in one place. It's a tremendous opportunity for sourcing and building relationships with people from around the league, for gathering info, all of that. I think as a result, it's good for the league because then it produces good reporting. It produces trades on the floor that you wouldn't see happening over the phone. It produces good television. It's the only time of the year that we get to see very private people, which the majority of general managers are. It's the only time we get to see Lou Lamoriello and Steve Yzerman actually doing work and actually sort of, you get to see how the sausage is made, if you will. So that part of it from a fan perspective, I think is also great. The television sort of viewing experience, I think they actually had a really good thing going. I think they do their drafts, or they have done traditionally their drafts in the NHL much better than most of the other professional leagues in North America. The centralized draft that the MLB does, for example, is a complete bore. It's not a TV event. Nobody tunes in. Their numbers are terrible. That's never been the case for the NHL. So right. Disappointing that way. Especially when the criteria given was strictly about scheduling. The schedule is something that the NHL has virtually full control over. I know that there are certain times when they like to start the season and finish the season, but if it was a matter of creating 2 or 3 more days between the draft and between free agency, they could have made amendments to the CBA to move free agency from July 1st to July 3rd, for example, or to move the draft from June 29th to June 26th, for example. They could have made that happen. They could have built that into the schedule and made an adjustment that way to give NHL teams the opportunity to get home. I know there was a lot of frustration getting out of Nashville last year, and flight issues and bad weather and all of that messed with people's ability to plan for free agency, and there was frustration from NHL clubs. I do think they may live to regret this decision, though. I also think they're going to see how it looks in the Sphere in Vegas, and it's going to be a huge success, a huge bang to go off on, and might make them second guess their decision. So we'll see what the decentralized draft looks like, but my guess is that it's going to be a much slower product on TV. We saw that during the pandemic draft when they hosted it out of their studios, the Secaucus studios for the NHL Network, just how brutally slow it was waiting for people to phone in their picks. Moves very quickly on draft day. They had it down to a science on draft day. So all of those are wrinkles that they're going to have to figure out. I think it could be pretty ugly for the first couple of years as they figure out what works and what doesn't, at least in terms of the TV product of it. But we'll see what it looks like. I'm very excited for Vegas. I think Vegas will be great. But after that, who knows?
Yeah, well, I mean, leave it to Gary Bettman to keep making mistakes with the league that he's trying to grow in the United States. But does that mean you're going to be in Vegas?
I will be in Vegas. Yep, the hotel's booked. The flights are booked. I'm staying at the Paris Casino. First time in Vegas. It's actually one of I think I've done 25 or 26 of the 32 NHL markets now, and it's one of the sort of 6 or 7 that I haven't hit. So looking forward to getting there, and I know my colleagues will take care of me because there's a lot of people in the last few years since expansion who've actually been a lot of journalists who've been there quite a lot. So I'm looking forward to the Vegas experience.
My only all I have to say is don't get sucked into the timeshare scam.
Yeah.
Yeah, and stay away from Circus. But other than that, you'll be fine in Vegas. Scott, we really appreciate you taking the time. It went a little longer than we had asked for, and we really appreciate you graciously taking the time. Just for our listeners, where can they find your articles as we get closer to the NHL draft for their NHL teams that they focus on?
Yeah, at Scott C. Wheeler on Twitter, or X as it's called now. And there's another thing that Gary Bettman feels like Gary Bettman screwed that up, but it wasn't Gary Bettman. But we won't get into that. Yeah, at Scott C. Wheeler on Twitter or X, and just at The Athletic. That's where all the work is. And I'm sure you'll be hearing about a certain Caleb Desnoyers this time next year.
All right, we got you penciled in for this time next year. Again, really appreciate you taking the time, Scott. Have a good night.
Cheers.